The metal clanking of the bars echoed down the corridor of the Polk County Jail. Paul Reeves pulled himself up on his hard bunk and rubbed his inflamed eyes. 16 months. That was how long he'd already spent within these walls, serving a 3-year sentence for a bar fight he barely remembered. Another day began with the familiar noise of breakfast trays and the roll call of the wardens. Paul swung his legs off the bunk and looked at his reflection in the dull metal mirror above the sink. His dark skin seemed grayish in the cold prison light. Over the months, his once strong auto mechanic's physique had been transformed into a wiry figure with protruding muscles, the result of endless hours in the prison gym, the only place where he could release his tension. "Reeves out," came Warden Thompson's voice. "You have a physical in 20 minutes. Paul nodded. Derek Thompson was one of the few wardens Paul respected, strict but fair. He didn't humiliate prisoners for no reason, and he kept his word. "I'll be right there," Paul replied, pulling on his orange prison robe. Tyrone, his cellmate, rolled over in his bunk. "Those doctors are going to torture you again. Just tell them you're fine, and that's the end of it." Paul grinned. If only it were that easy. Routine physical examinations were part of the prison routine. Usually they were quick and pointless, a formal procedure to check off a box on the paperwork. But lately Paul had been feeling really bad. Constant fatigue, night sweats, and occasional coughing for no apparent reason. He blamed it on prison food and stress. The corridor of the prison medical unit was illuminated by bright fluorescent lights, giving everything around him an unnatural pale hue. Paul sat down on a plastic chair in front of Dr. Johnson's office. Through the glass partition, he could see the gray-haired doctor concentrating on something on the computer, making occasional notes. "Reeves, come in," the doctor said as the warden led Paul inside. Dr. Marcus Johnson had worked at the Polk County Jail for 15 years. In that time, he'd seen a lot of things and had learned to maintain a professional composure no matter what the circumstances. His dark-skinned face with deep wrinkles around his eyes showed fatigue, but his gaze remained attentive. "How are you feeling?" the doctor asked, pointing Paul to the couch. "I'm fine," Paul answered, but immediately coughed, as if to contradict his own words. "How long has this been going on?" Johnson pulled out a stethoscope. "A couple weeks, maybe more. I'm also sweating at night." The doctor listened carefully to Paul's lungs, took his blood pressure, and swabbed his throat. "It's probably just an infection, but we'll do a full workup. We'll have the results in a few days." Paul nodded indifferently. Time flowed differently in prison. Days stretched into infinity, and then a week went by without a second thought. He returned to his cell and fell into the usual routine: lunch, an hour in the gym, watching an old TV in the common room, dinner, bedtime. 4 days later, he was called back in to see Dr. Johnson. This time, something was different. The doctor looked tense, and in the office sat another woman, Mrs. Carter, the prison psychologist. "Have a seat, Paul," the doctor said without looking him in the eye. Paul sank slowly into the chair, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Is it something serious, Doc?" Dr. Johnson took a deep breath. "Paul, your test results are back. I have some unpleasant news. Your tests came back positive for HIV. It was as if time had stopped." Paul heard the doctor continue to talk about additional tests, about treatment, about how modern medicine makes it possible to live with this diagnosis for many years. But the words passed by his consciousness, dissolving into the hum that filled his head. "It's a mistake," Paul finally said, clenching his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. "We ran the test twice to rule out a mistake," the doctor replied softly. "I'm sorry, Paul." "How is that possible?" Paul's voice shook with restrained rage. "I didn't use drugs. I didn't have—" He paused as the thought of Zoe flashed through his mind, his wife, the only person he'd had a close relationship with before his incarceration. Dr. Johnson exchanged a glance with the psychologist. "HIV can be transmitted in many ways, Paul. The important thing is not how you got infected, but that we should start treatment as soon as possible." The rest of the conversation passed like a blur. Paul nodded mechanically, signed some papers, listened to recommendations. A storm of emotions was growing inside him, which he could hardly contain under the mask of calmness. Back in his cell, Paul lay silently on the bunk, staring at the ceiling. His cellmate Tyrone realized that something serious had happened. but he didn't question him. He knew when to stay away. Paul spent the next 2 days in almost complete silence, immersed in his thoughts. Memories and images flashed through his mind, forming a monstrous mosaic. 3 years ago, he had met Zoe in an automobile repair shop, where she had come with a defective car. The young, beautiful elementary school teacher immediately attracted his attention. 6 months later, they were married, and another year later, there was that unfortunate bar fight. Paul remembered that evening in fragments: loud music, a conversation with some guys, an insult that turned into a fight, a blow, after which his opponent fell and hit his head on the edge of the table. Serious bodily injury, 3 years in prison. Zoe promised to wait. Every month she came for visits, brought books, talked about her schoolwork, her life on the outside, always smiling, always telling me she loved me. And now this diagnosis. HIV. How? On the 3rd day after his visit to the doctor, Tyrone finally decided to break the silence. "Hey, brother, you're walking like a ghost. What happened at the docks?" Paul stared at his cellmate for a long time, wondering if he should tell him. Tyrone was the only person he had normal contact with in prison. Not a friend, but close to it. "I have HIV," Paul said quietly, saying the words out loud for the first time. Tyrone whistled and shook his head. "Shit, bro, this is serious. Are you sure?" The doctor said the test was done twice. Tyrone sat down on his bunk across from him. "Any idea where from?" Paul gritted his teeth. "Only one." Tyrone nodded understandingly. "Your girl, huh? You think she's out walking around while you're here?" Paul didn't answer. The thought that Zoe might be cheating on him while he was serving time was agonizing. But how else to explain the diagnosis? He'd been perfectly healthy before prison, no symptoms, no risks. "Listen," Tyrone continued, lowering his voice. "I haven't told you this before, but my cousin works as a security guard at the mall, and his wife has also had an affair and gave him the disease." Paul's heart sank. "You think my wife could cheat on me?" "Trust me, brother, they all are." Paul jumped up and paced the cell, clenching and unclenching his fists. So while he was sitting here paying for his stupidity, Zoe was out having fun. And not just having fun, but catching HIV and passing it on to him. "She's coming next week," Paul hissed. "What are you going to do?" Tyrone asked. Paul stopped and turned to his cellmate. There was cold determination in his eyes. "I'm going to find out the truth." That night, sleep did not come. Paul tossed and turned on the hard bunk, torn by conflicting feelings. Love for Zoe struggled with anger and betrayal. Memories of happy days were replaced by images of her in the arms of another man. And on top of it all loomed the dreaded diagnosis of HIV. The doctor said that with modern treatment one could live a long life, but what kind of life would it be? The constant medication, the risk to others, the stigma of a disease that society still feared and despised. And now, thanks to Zoe, that fate was reserved for him. The next day, Paul visited Dr. Johnson again to confirm the details of his condition. "When do you think the infection occurred?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The doctor thought for a moment. "According to the test results, it's relatively recent, perhaps in the last 6 to 9 months. But it's hard to be more precise without more tests." 6 to 9 months. He'd been in prison for 16. The math was simple and ruthless. "And another thing, doctor. If a person knows of their diagnosis and intentionally infects others, is that a crime?" Dr. Johnson looked at Paul carefully. "Yes. In most states, including Iowa, it is a crime. But Paul, don't jump to conclusions. Talk to your wife first." Paul nodded, but inside he had already made up his mind. He would talk to Zoe, and he would find out the truth. As he walked back to his cell, he thought about his upcoming date, which was only 4 days away. 4 days until he met the woman who had ruined his life twice. First by persuading him to go to that bar, and now by condemning him to a life of terminal illness. The day before the date, Paul received confirmation that Zoe was coming. She always came, never missed a visit. Even now, knowing she'd betrayed him, she continued to play the role of loyal wife. "Have you decided what you're going to tell her?" Tyrone asked as he watched Paul getting ready for bed. "Yes," Paul answered briefly. "I'm going to find out the whole truth." He lay down on the bunk, closing his eyes. Images of Zoe, smiling, loving, betraying, floated before his mind. The thought of how she could have done this to him drove him crazy. Had she really known about her diagnosis? Had she deliberately infected him? Tomorrow he would have all the answers and decide how to proceed. Insomnia had become Paul Reeves's constant companion. Another night he lay on the prison bunk, staring at the cracks in the ceiling as memories flooded his mind. The silence was broken only by Tyrone's measured breathing and the distant footsteps of the warden in the corridor. Paul closed his eyes, and the past came flooding back to him in vivid images. The first time he'd met Zoe at the machine shop. She had come in an old Ford with a faulty clutch. He remembered her confused smile as she tried to explain the problem, and his own excitement, atypical of the usually confident auto mechanic. The short hair gathered into neat pigtails, the attentive look in her brown eyes, the teacher's slender hands that contrasted so much with his work-hardened palms. Then there was the first awkward conversation, when he had the courage to call the number left on the client's card. Their first date in a modest cafe near the school where she taught third graders. The way she talked about her students with such love, as if she were talking about her own children. A quick, tumultuous 6 months, ending with a modest wedding in the presence of a few friends and her parents. His parents weren't present. His father had passed away years ago, and his mother, broken by a hard life, had passed away 2 years before meeting Zoe. Their small apartment on the outskirts of Des Moines. Weekends together, filled with laughter and plans for the future. Talking about kids, a house of their own, maybe the small auto shop Paul had always dreamed of opening. And then the memories shifted to the fateful night at the Blue Moose Bar. Paul remembered Zoe urging him to meet her co-workers. "Please, Paul," she'd said, hugging him around the neck. "It's just a little corporate event. The director's retiring. Everyone will be with their soulmates." "You know I don't really like these gatherings," he grumbled, but he couldn't resist her pleading gaze. The bar was full. Zoe's co-workers, mostly teachers and a couple of administrators, were loudly discussing school news, blaring over the music. Paul felt out of place. He had never been a fan of noisy company, preferring quiet evenings at home or get-togethers with close friends. After the third beer, he felt better. He even got into a conversation with the husband of one of the teachers, discussing the latest sports news. Then some guys showed up, not from their group. One of them started making deliberately loud comments about the appearance of the women present, including Zoe. Paul remembered the anger growing inside. His memories became fragmentary, the way he had approached the guy's table, the verbal altercation, the first push, the blow, the screams, the clinking of broken glass. And then, the body on the floor, the blood from the broken head, someone's cries of "call an ambulance," the handcuffs, the police station. Paul opened his eyes, coming back to the reality of the prison cell. Tyrone was snoring softly on the next bunk. In those 16 months, Paul had replayed that night 1,000 times in his mind, asking himself time after time what he could have done differently. Not go to the bar, not drink, ignore the shouting of those guys? But now all of those musings seemed meaningless in the face of a new discovery. HIV, a word that now poisoned every thought, and Zoe, the only person he could have contracted it from. In the morning during breakfast, the warden, Derek Thompson, approached him. "Reeves, you have a date with your wife scheduled for today, right?" he asked, flipping through the papers in his clipboard. "Yes," Paul answered briefly, stirring his tasteless oatmeal with a plastic spoon. Thompson looked at him carefully. "Everything all right? You look tense." "I'm fine," Paul lied without looking up. "Look, I know what the physical told you," Thompson said in a lowered voice. "Dr. Johnson notified management. It's standard procedure. If you need psychological help." "I don't need a psychologist," Paul cut him off abruptly. "I need to talk to my wife." Thompson studied his face for a while, then nodded. "Okay, a date at 14 o'clock in meeting room number 3. Standard 30 minutes. Can I ask a favor?" Paul finally looked up. "Can I have a little more privacy? Something I want to discuss with my wife. It's personal." The warden hesitated. "I can't leave you completely unsupervised, you know the rules. But I can give you a place in the far corner of the room, and I'll keep my distance, as long as you don't make any sudden movements." "Thank you," Paul thanked him sincerely. Thompson was always fair, even in a system as strict as prison. "Just remember, Reeves," the warden added as he was about to leave, "whatever problems you have with your wife, this is not the place to solve them by force. Do you understand?" "I understand," Paul nodded, and the warden looked at him carefully once more and walked away. After breakfast, Paul spent an hour in the gym, pushing as much weight as he could on the machines, as if trying to squeeze out his anger and pain. Then went back to his cell to prepare for his meeting with Zoe. He sat on the edge of his bunk, contemplating the upcoming conversation. How to begin? What to say? Directly accuse her of cheating and contracting HIV? Or gradually bring the subject up, watching for reactions? Tyrone returned from his work in the laundry room, and, noticing Paul's condition, sat down next to him. "What are you planning to do, brother?" he asked quietly. "I haven't decided yet," Paul answered, "but I must know the truth. I have to hear it from her." "Don't do anything stupid," Tyrone warned. "You don't want to get extra time because of that traitor." Paul nodded, but inside something cold and dark was beginning to take shape. The thought of Zoe betraying his trust while he sat in prison, torn with longing for her, filled him with a rage he could barely contain. At 12 o'clock, Paul was called to the medical unit. Dr. Johnson wanted to discuss a treatment plan. "We'll start antiretroviral therapy next week," the doctor said, showing Paul the medication regimen. "Modern drugs can keep your viral load at an undetectable level. With proper treatment, you can lead a normal life." Paul listened half-heartedly, mentally preparing for his meeting with Zoe. But one phrase made him wary. "What did you say?" he asked again. "I'm saying that if your wife is infected, she needs to start treatment too," the doctor repeated. "Both of you will need to take medication and get regular checkups." "What if she knew about her diagnosis before she infected me?" Paul asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dr. Johnson took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Paul, I understand what you're thinking, but don't jump to conclusions. Many people live with HIV for years without realizing it. Symptoms may not show up for a long time." "But you said yourself that the infection is recent," Paul insisted. "In the last 6 to 9 months. I've been in prison for 16. Who else could have infected me besides my wife?" The doctor sighed. "Technically, yes. The most likely infection was through sexual contact during a date. But, she definitely infected me," Paul interrupted. "And if she knew about her diagnosis, if she did it on purpose, that's a crime, right?" "Yes, intentional exposure to HIV is a felony in Iowa," the doctor reluctantly admitted, "but proving intent is very difficult. And Paul, I strongly recommend that you talk to your wife calmly first. Not to accuse, but to clarify the situation." Paul nodded, but in his heart he had already made up his mind. The doctor's words only made him more certain. Zoe had betrayed him. She had jeopardized his life, condemned him to a lifelong illness, and for that she must answer. Back in his cell, Paul began to prepare for his date. He showered, shaved thoroughly, even asked the warden for a clean uniform. "You look like you're going to a wedding," Tyrone remarked as he watched the preparations. "Are you sure you just want to talk?" "I just want to look normal," Paul answered, brushing his short hair. But really, that was part of the plan. He wanted Zoe to relax, to feel safe, so that she wouldn't suspect his real intentions until the last moment. The plan slowly crystallized in his head. He would ask Zoe a direct question about fidelity. Then he would inform her of his diagnosis and watch her reaction. If she admits to cheating, if she confirms his suspicions, what then? Paul didn't yet know exactly what he would do, but the dark, destructive feeling inside him demanded action. It demanded justice, or what he understood justice to be. At 13:30, he was ready. He sat on the bunk, hands folded in his lap, outwardly calm but inwardly tense as a spring. "Reeves, out!" came the voice of Warden Thompson. "Your wife has already arrived." Paul stood up slowly and took a deep breath. Tyrone nodded to him as if in encouragement. The walk to the visiting room seemed endless. Each step rang in his ears. "Remember what I said," Thompson said quietly, leading him down the hall. "No trouble. No problem," Paul echoed. They stopped in front of the door of visiting room number 3. From behind the door came the muffled voices of the other prisoners and their visitors. "Ready?" Thompson asked, gripping the doorknob. Paul nodded, gathering all his resolve. The door opened. In the far corner of the room, he immediately spotted Zoe. She was sitting at a small table, nervously fumbling with her purse. A smile blossomed on her face at the sight of Paul, and she rose to meet him. With a heavy heart, Paul moved toward her, through a room filled with other prisoners and their loved ones. With each step, his anger and determination only grew stronger. She had betrayed him. She had ruined his life. She must answer for that. During the brief embrace allowed by prison rules, he smelled the familiar scent of her shampoo, the same one he'd always smelled, as if nothing had changed, like she hadn't ruined his life with her betrayal. "I missed you so much," Zoe whispered, looking into his eyes with a smile. "I have so much news." "Me too," Paul replied, sitting down across from her. "Very important news." He looked at the face of the woman he had once loved more than anything else in the world, and thought that soon that face would be contorted with fear and realization. Soon the mask of the faithful wife would fall away. Soon the truth would come out. Paul slowly folded his hands on the table, noting the distance to Zoe's neck. A meter, no more. It would only take a second to reach. Warden Thompson was at the other end of the room, watching the other couple. That should give us plenty of time. "What did you want to talk about, darling?" Zoe asked, still smiling. "Has something happened?" "Yes," Paul replied, watching her face carefully. "Something did happen, and we need to have a serious talk." The smile slowly slid off Zoe's face. Something in her husband's voice made her wary. The visiting room was filled with other inmates and their visitors. The hum of conversations, laughter, crying, all these sounds created a background noise through which they looked at each other as if they were in a bubble. "You seem strange today," Zoe said, nervously fixing her braid. "Is everything all right?" Paul didn't take his eyes off her. The woman sitting across from him looked exactly the same as she always did during their dates, the same caring eyes, the same gentle smile. But now he saw her as a stranger, a traitor. "I've learned something," he began, trying to keep his voice calm. "Something that changed everything." Zoe frowned. "What are you talking about?" Paul slowly folded his hands on the table, fighting the urge to reach for her throat right now. "I had a physical last week," he said. "The usual procedure, nothing special, but they did tests." Suddenly, Zoe turned pale. It was a momentary, barely noticeable reaction, but Paul caught it. And that reaction told him more than any words could. "What did the tests show?" she asked, and there was a faint tremor in her voice. "I have HIV, Zoe," Paul said, keeping his eyes on her. It was as if the room had gone quiet. Though there was still talking, laughing, crying, for Paul it was just the two of them and the awful truth that hung between them. Zoe inhaled sharply. Her hand trembled, and she leaned back in her chair as if trying to put distance between herself and his words. "What?" she whispered. This is impossible." "Dr. Johnson did 2 tests," Paul replied. "The result is positive. I'm infected with HIV." "Oh my God," Zoe exhaled, tears welling up in her eyes. "Paul, I'm so sorry." Her reaction seemed genuine, fear, sympathy, shock. But Paul didn't believe her anymore. Not one word, not one gesture. "I'm only curious about one thing, Zoe," he continued, lowering his voice to almost a whisper. "How did this happen? How could I have gotten infected after being in prison for 16 months? Zoe was silent, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. "The doctor says the infection is recent," Paul continued. "In the last 6 to 9 months." "There must be some mistake," Zoe whispered. "It's impossible." "Stop lying," Paul hissed, and his tone made Zoe flinch. "I know what happened. I want to hear it from you." "Paul, I don't know what you mean." "You cheated on me," Paul interrupted her. "All this time I've been sitting here, thinking about you every minute, pining for you. You've been sleeping with other men." Zoe shook her head, her face contorted in pain. "No, Paul, no, I never—" "And then," he continued, ignoring her protests, "then you got HIV. And instead of coming clean, warning me, you kept coming here. You kept playing the role of loving wife, and you infected me. Paul, listen to me. Zoe reached across the table, trying to touch him. This is some kind of misunderstanding. I never cheated on you. I love you. Paul pulled his hands away, preventing her from touching him. Then explain, he demanded. Explain how I got infected, because the only way I could have gotten it was through you. And the only way you could have gotten infected was through sexual contact with another man, or men. Zoe lowered her head, covering her face with her hands. I don't know, Paul. I swear I don't know. Maybe it happened some other way. Maybe what? Paul interrupted her. Maybe the virus came out of thin air? Maybe it's a miracle? Don't insult my intelligence, Zoe. His voice grew louder, and several people at neighboring tables turned around. Warden Thompson, who was standing against the wall, took a step forward, but didn't intervene yet. Reeves, calm down, he warned from a distance. Paul took a deep breath, forcing himself to keep his voice down. Last chance, Zoe. Tell me the truth. I deserve to know. Zoe raised her tear-stained eyes to his. There was such pain in them that for a moment Paul almost believed he was wrong, that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But then he remembered the doctor's words, the inexorable logic of the facts. Paul, she whispered, I don't know what to say. I didn't cheat on you, and I don't have HIV. At least I don't know anything about it. You're lying, Paul hissed, leaning across the table toward her. You knew everything, and you came to me anyway. Why, Zoe, to get revenge? For getting me here? For leaving you alone? Something changed in Zoe's eyes. It was as if the mask had cracked, and for a moment there was another face, cold, calculating. You've always been perceptive, she said in a completely different tone of voice. Too shrewd for your own good. Paul froze, stunned by the sudden change. So it's true. Zoe leaned back in her chair, wiping away the tears that now seemed fake. What did you want, Paul? For me to sit at home like a nun for the 3 years of your imprisonment? For me to exist only for our rare visits? Her words hit Paul harder than he could have imagined. It was one thing to suspect, another to hear a confession from the man he loved most in the world. How many were there? He asked hoarsely. Zoe shrugged with a strange indifference. I didn't count. First there were casual liaisons. Then Michael came along. Things got more serious with him. We've been dating for almost a year now. And HIV? Paul could barely speak with rage. When did you find out? Zoe was silent, as if considering whether to continue the revelation. 4 months ago, Michael warned me that he had found out about his diagnosis. I took a test. It was positive. And you kept coming to me anyway. Paul didn't ask, he asserted, knowing you could make me sick. Yes, Zoe replied simply. She continued. Why? Paul squeezed out. Why did you do it? Zoe's eyes flashed with anger for a moment. Why do you think? You ruined my life, Paul. Because of your stupid bar fight, because of your inability to control your anger, I ended up tied to a man in prison. Everyone felt sorry for me, looked at me with sympathy. Poor Zoe, her husband in prison, and she's still so loyal to him. She grinned bitterly. Do you know how many times I wanted to just walk away, file for divorce, start a new life? But I always stopped, afraid of being judged, afraid of what people would say if I left my husband while he was in prison. So it was revenge, Paul said, feeling cold inside. You deliberately infected me to get revenge. Zoe looked him straight in the eye. I didn't plan to infect you, but when I found out I was diagnosed, yeah, I could have stopped dating. I could have told you the truth, but I chose not to. Maybe somewhere deep down inside, I really wanted you to feel a fraction of the pain you caused me. Her words echoed in Paul's head like hammer blows. Each confession, each phrase shattered what was left of his heart. You're a monster, he whispered. I loved you. In spite of everything, I loved you. And you... And I never asked for that love, Zoe snapped at him. I never asked for that devotion to the grave. All I wanted was a normal life. No fights, no prison, no weekly visits to this damn place. But you couldn't even give me that. You and your uncontrollable anger. Something clicked in Paul's head, like a blown fuse. All the surrounding noise, the talking, the laughter, the hum, suddenly disappeared. All that was left was Zoe across from him, her face contorted with anger and contempt, her lips uttering horrible words, lips that he had once kissed, lips that now carried death to him. "You know what the ironic thing is?" Zoe continued, not noticing the change in Paul's face. "That night at the bar, I talked you into going there on purpose, hoping you'd get drunk and be more cooperative. I was going to tell you that I needed a break from our relationship, that I wanted to be on my own. But you put up this fight and all plans went to hell." Paul listened to her, and every word was like a knife in his heart. Everything was a lie. Every moment of their life together, every show of affection on her part, everything was a fake. "You have no idea how much I hated those visits," Zoe continued, as if a dam had burst, and now she couldn't stop. "Every time I looked at you in that orange robe, listening to your pathetic stories about prison life, I thought of only one thing: when it would be over. But there was a role to play good, faithful wife. Everyone admired my devotion. If they only knew." Paul suddenly saw the whole picture of his love for Zoe, from their first meeting to this moment, like a movie film scrolling before his eyes. Every happy moment now seemed poisoned with lies. "And then there was Michael," Zoe continued, as if enjoying his torment. "He was so different from you, calm, rational, intelligent, no fights, no outbursts of rage." "Stop it," Paul whispered, but she wouldn't listen. "When he told me the diagnosis, I was shocked, of course, but we both started treatment. The doctor said that with the right therapy, you could live a normal life for years to come, and then I thought about you and what you'd done to me." Zoe leaned across the table to him. "I could have stopped our dating. I could have told you the truth. But I decided not to. Let it be, I think, my little revenge for all the suffering you've caused me." "Did you know it was a crime?" Paul asked, his voice sounding strangely calm. "Intentionally contracting HIV is a felony." Zoe grinned. "And what are you going to do about it? Sue me? Who would believe a prisoner against a respected elementary school teacher who had waited faithfully for her husband all the years of his incarceration? Her arrogance, her contempt for him was the last straw. Everything that had held back Paul's anger crumbled in an instant. He didn't remember getting up from his chair. He didn't remember walking around the table. All he could see in front of him was Zoe, her hateful face, her angry words ringing in his ears. "Paul?" There was a sudden fear in her voice. "What are you doing?" He didn't know. His hands seemed to have a life of their own. They reached for her neck, wrapped around it. His fingers clenched. Zoe's eyes widened in horror. She tried to scream, but only wheezes came out of her throat. Her hands came up, clawing at his fingers, trying to loosen his grip. But Paul was stronger, much stronger. Chaos reigned around them. Some were screaming, some calling for help. Other inmates and visitors were panicking, backing away from them, creating an empty space. "Reeves, let her go, Warden." Thompson's voice broke through the fog of rage that enveloped Paul's mind. "Now!" But Paul wouldn't listen. He couldn't stop. All that stood before his eyes was Zoe's face, contorted with fear. Her eyes were beginning to roll back, but he kept squeezing. "Call for help!" Thompson shouted from somewhere nearby. "And medics!" Paul felt someone trying to pull him away, but the grip didn't loosen. It was as if his hands were determined to finish the job, regardless of his will. Zoe stopped struggling. Her arms hung lifelessly, her eyes rolled back. Paul continued to squeeze, watching the life drain out of her, as the woman he loved disappeared, the woman who had betrayed him and condemned him to a slow death. Finally, 3 guards pulled him away from Zoe. Her body slid to the floor, a lifeless doll. Someone rushed over to her, trying to feel for a pulse. Someone started CPR. Paul was thrown to the floor, hands clasped behind her back. Handcuffs clicked. He didn't fight back. All the rage vanished as suddenly as it had come, leaving only emptiness. "No pulse!" shouted someone leaning over Zoe. "Starting CPR!" Paul lay on the floor, pinned down by the weight of the guards, and watched as the other guards and the prison medical officer tried to bring Zoe back to life. Indirect heart massage, CPR. But he could see in their faces that they knew the truth. It's too late. The room is empty. All the visitors and other prisoners had been rushed out. Only the guards, the medics, and Paul, still pinned to the floor, remained. "Reeves, what's gotten into you?" Thompson's voice sounded over his ear. "Do you realize what you've done?" Paul didn't answer. The words seemed meaningless. Nothing could explain what had happened between him and Zoe. Nothing could justify his actions. He wasn't looking for an excuse. "Time of death, 1436, the nurse said, finally stopping resuscitation. "There's nothing I can do, she's dead." Silence descended on the room. Zoe's body was covered with someone's jacket. Paul was jerked to his feet. "Take him to the holding cell," the superintendent ordered, "and call the state police. This is no longer an internal prison matter." Paul was led down the corridors. The prisoners on the way gave him silent glances. News traveled fast in the prison. Everyone already knew that Reeves had killed his wife on a date. "Why did you do it, Reeves?" Thompson asked when they reached the cell block. "I mean, she came to see you every week, waiting for you. She was loyal." Paul looked at the warden, and something in his gaze made Thompson take a step back. "Everything was a lie," Paul said. "Everything." The door of the SHU opened, and Paul was led inside. A small, windowless cell, with a single lamp under the ceiling, protected by bars. An iron bunk bolted to the floor. A toilet in the corner. "You'll be taken to the county jail soon," Thompson said, uncuffing him. "The trial will be in the city, not here. And Reeves, you're looking at life in prison, you understand?" Paul rubbed his wrists slowly and sat on the edge of the bunk. "I understand." Thompson shook his head. "You blew it, kid. You had less than a year and a half to go before you were released. And now—" He didn't finish the sentence. "What the hell for?" Paul didn't answer. What could he say? How could he explain that the life he'd longed to return to was just an illusion? That the woman he'd held onto for all those months had turned out to be a monster who'd deliberately infected him with a deadly disease? The cell door closed, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The sounds of the prison came muffled, as if from another world. Paul sat on the edge of the bunk, staring into the void. His hands, now free of the handcuffs, still remembered the feel of Zoe's neck. The neck he had so often hugged lovingly. The neck he'd squeezed until the life was gone from it. A strange calm took hold of him. It was as if the storm that had raged inside all these days had finally subsided, leaving behind a scorched wasteland. No regret, no fear, not even anger. Only the realization of the inevitability of what had happened. She had betrayed him, infected him with a deadly disease, intentionally, deliberately condemned him to a slow decline. For that, he took her life, an eye for an eye, a life for a life, ancient as the world, the law of retribution. An hour later, the door of the SU opened. The prison director stood on the doorstep, accompanied by 2 state police officers. "Paul Reeves, you are under arrest for first-degree murder," one of the officers said as he entered the cell. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Standard procedure. Paul listened without interrupting. When the officer finished reading his rights, he stood silently and held out his hands for the handcuffs. "What happened, Reeves?" the prison director asked. "What did she do to you?" "She infected me with HIV, Paul answered in an even voice, intentionally, knowing about her diagnosis. The officers looked at each other. The director frowned. "This is a serious accusation," he said. "Is there proof?" "My positive test," Paul replied. "And her confession, just before I—" He didn't finish the sentence. "That still doesn't justify murder," one of the officers remarked as he snapped on the handcuffs. "I know," Paul said calmly. "I'm not looking for excuses. I did what I did." He was led through the prison corridors toward the exit. On the way, they passed the visiting room, now cordoned off. Zoe's body was gone. It must have been taken to the morgue. But Paul could see the chalk marks on the floor, tracing the outline of her body, and bloodstains, probably from resuscitation attempts. "Hey, Reeves!" called out to him from the common cell they were passing. "Is it true you strangled your wife? Right here in prison?" Paul didn't answer, but he could tell by the murmur of voices that the rumor had already spread throughout the prison. By tomorrow, the story would be a dozen versions, each more horrible than the last. They went to the back of the prison where the police car was parked. The day was overcast, as it had been since morning, but it had not started to rain. Gray sky, gray walls, gray road ahead. "Get in the car," the officer commanded, opening the back door. Paul obediently leaned over and got into the passenger compartment. There was no way out. Ahead was the trial, the sentence, life imprisonment, and a slow death from the disease Zoe had given him. But strangely, this prospect did not frighten him, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose, perhaps because a part of him had died with Zoe in that visiting room. The car touched down, taking him away from the Polk County jail that had witnessed his latest crime. Paul stared out the window at the passing scenery and thought about how bizarre life can be sometimes, how love can turn to hate, how trust can turn into betrayal, and how quickly you can lose everything you believed in.